Oligarchs. It sounds like a brand of fancy cigarettes or maybe a villainous group from a Bond film, but sadly it's not that glamorous. Oligarchs are basically just super rich people with too much power. They're the folks who can buy a yacht with a helipad on a whim while the rest of us are clipping coupons for ramen noodles. And the worst part, their influence seeps into every corner of our lives, from the gas we pump to the politicians we try to elect. Think back to history class. Remember those emperors and pharaohs with absolute control? Oligarchs are like their modern-day equivalents, just with better tailors and worse haircuts. They've existed for centuries, hoarding wealth and pulling strings from the shadows. Except now, thanks to globalization and some seriously lax financial regulations, their playground has become the entire world. But here's the thing about oligarchs. They don't want you thinking about them too much. They thrive on staying in the background, using their wealth and influence to manipulate systems and bend rules in their favor. They're like the puppet masters you never see, controlling the show while everyone else is distracted by the shiny things. So, how do these oligarchs get so much power? Well, it's not by winning a most likely to share award, that's for sure. It usually starts with amassing a ridiculous amount of wealth, often through industries like oil, gas, or finance. Think of it like a game of Monopoly, but instead of passing go and collecting $200, they're buying up entire countries and laughing maniacally. But money alone isn't enough. They need to convert that cash into something more potent influence. This is where things get sneaky. They donate generously to political campaigns, essentially buying themselves a whole bunch of friends in high places. They fund think tanks and media outlets to push their agendas and shape public opinion. And if all else fails, they use their vast resources to tie up anyone who dares to challenge them in court. It's a vicious cycle, really. More money equals more power, which in turn leads to even more money. And the more power they accumulate, the harder it becomes to break their grip on the levers of society. It's enough to make you want to scream into the void, or at least write a strongly worded letter to your congressman, assuming they haven't been bought by an oligarch already. Let's talk about politics, baby. Just kidding, politics is depressing. Especially when you realize how much influence oligarchs have over the very people who are supposed to represent us. Remember those political donations we talked about? Yeah, those aren't just for a fancy dinner and a photo op. They buy access, influence, and quite possibly entire laws written to benefit the donor's bottom line. It's like a game of follow the money, but with higher stakes and fewer morals. A group of billionaires decides they want a tax break, so they funnel money to politicians who support their cause. Suddenly, surprise, surprise, that tax break is passed into law, while the rest of us are left scratching our heads and wondering how the hell that happened. And it's not just limited to one country or political system. Oligarchs play the long game, cultivating relationships with powerful figures across the globe. They wine and dine them, fund their projects, and whisper sweet nothings about deregulation and tax havens in their ears. You know that feeling when you read a news headline and think, wait, this sounds suspiciously like a bunch of rich dudes rigging the system in their favor. Yeah, that's your oligarch sensing spidey sense tingling. Because their influence is so pervasive, it's often difficult to pinpoint exactly where it starts and ends. But trust me, it's there, lurking beneath the surface like a particularly greedy sea monster. Take, for example, the ever-widening gap between the rich and everyone else. While billionaires are blasting off into space and building underground bunkers for the apocalypse, wages for the average person have stagnated for decades. Coincidence? I think not. It's the direct result of policies designed to benefit the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. Or how about those stories about corporations paying little to no taxes despite raking in billions in profits? Yeah, that's oligarchs using their influence to rewrite the rules in their favor. They've got armies of lawyers and accountants whose sole purpose is to exploit loopholes and minimize their tax burden, while the rest of us dutifully pay our fair share, or at least try to. Section 5, the rich get richer and you get another subscription service you can't afford. Okay, let's talk about the economy, specifically how oligarchs use their economic power to, well, make themselves even more powerful. It's a bit like that game where you kick someone while they're down, except In this case, the kicking involves manipulating markets, crushing competition, and generally ensuring that the little guy, that's you and me, never gets ahead. Remember when we talked about monopolies back in the monopoly analogy? Yeah, those aren't just confined to board games. Oligarchs love monopolies because they eliminate competition and allow them to set prices however high they please. They'll buy up their rivals, undercut smaller businesses, and lobby governments to create regulations that benefit them while hindering everyone else. And don't even get me started on the whole too big to fail thing. You know, when a company screws up so badly that it threatens to bring down the entire economy, suddenly they're bailed out by the government, read taxpayers, because, well, no one wants to see the world burn, right? Except, wouldn't it be nice if those companies faced actual consequences for their actions instead of getting a free pass because they're rich and powerful? Just a thought. Section 6. They've got the money, so they get to write the culture. Hold on to your hats, folks, because we're about to dive headfirst into the murky waters of culture. And yes, you guessed it, oligarchs have their grubby little hands in this too. Because when you control that much wealth and power, you get to shape the narratives, values and beliefs that define our world. Think about the media we consume, the news we read, the movies we watch. A significant chunk of it is owned or influenced by a handful of corporations and individuals, many of whom are, you guessed it, oligarchs. They use these platforms to push their agendas, promote their interests, and generally make sure the world sees things their way. But it goes beyond that. They fund universities and research institutions, influencing the very knowledge that is produced and disseminated. They donate to museums and art galleries, shaping the cultural landscape and deciding what art is worthy of our attention. They're like those kids in school who always had the coolest toys and got to decide who got to play with them. Section 7, fighting back. Because nobody likes a rich kid who won't share. Okay, I know what you're thinking. This is incredibly depressing. Is there any hope? Should we all just give up, move into a yurt in the woods and subsist on berries and the bitter tears of our collective disillusionment? Well, you could do that, but it might be a tad extreme. Plus, have you seen the price of yurts lately? Inflation is a real bitch. The good news is that it's not entirely hopeless. There are things we can do, both individually and collectively, to fight back against oligarchic influence and create a more just and equitable world. It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight, but it's worth fighting for. First and foremost, we need to get educated. We need to understand how oligarchs operate, how they wield their power, and how their actions impact our lives. Knowledge is power. And the more we know, the better equipped we'll be to challenge the status quo. Section 8. It's not just about money, it's about power, but also it's definitely about money. Here's the thing about fighting oligarchs. It's not just about redistributing wealth, although that's definitely a part of it. It's about dismantling the systems that allow them to accumulate and maintain so much power in the first place. It's about creating a world where everyone has a fair shot, where opportunities are based on merit, not the size of your bank account. So what can we do? Well, for starters, we can support organizations and movements that are fighting for economic justice, social equality, and a more democratic society. We can vote for politicians who genuinely represent our interests and not the interests of their wealthy donors. We can hold corporations accountable for their actions and demand greater transparency and accountability from those in power. And perhaps most importantly, we can start talking about it. We need to raise awareness about the issue of oligarchic influence, challenge the narratives that perpetuate it, and demand better from our leaders. Because the only way to defeat a powerful enemy is to first shine a light on them. Section 9. So you're telling me there's a chance? Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. The fight against oligarchic influence is a marathon, not a sprint. These systems have been entrenched for decades, if not centuries, and they won't be dismantled overnight. But that doesn't mean we should give up. On the contrary, it means we need to fight even harder, with even more determination. The truth is, change is possible. History is full of examples of ordinary people coming together to challenge the powerful and demand a better world. From the abolition of slavery to the fight for women's suffrage, progress has always been met with resistance, but it has also always prevailed in the end. So the next time you read a headline about a billionaire buying a private island or a politician passing legislation that benefits the wealthy at the expense of everyone else, Don't just get angry, get active. Get informed, get involved, and get ready to fight for a future where power resides with the people, not a select few at the top. Because a better world is possible, but only if we're willing to fight for it.